embedded in the religious symbolism didn't develop at all. And so we're in this unstable situation where we're far more technologically proficient than we are wise. And that's actually a big problem, because obviously the more powerful the tools you generate, the more intelligent ethically you better be, or things are going to really are going to go to hell in a handbasket very, very rapidly, you know. And I had this thought, I think I shared it a little bit last night, that, you know, in the next 5 years, 6 years, we're going to develop pretty viciously intelligent AI systems, and that's already happening, you know. I mean, they're monitoring YouTube, and they're monitoring Facebook, and they're monitoring Google, and they're trying to make ethical decisions, these AI systems. And the problem is that the ethical presuppositions of the programmers are being embedded into the infrastructure of the net. And that's a hell of a thing to think, because it means that for better or worse, we're building automated intelligences that reflect our own morality. And we better be very careful about what our morality is if we're going to automate it, because automated systems are incredibly powerful. So that's where we're at least to some degree, in terms of the new technological transformations in communication technology. You know, it puts each of us at the center of a wide web of connections, and makes the consequences of our moral decisions much more immediately manifest to each of us. It kind of begs the question too, like, how should you behave on Facebook, and how should you behave on Twitter? I think Twitter drives me a little bit crazy. You know, I'm on it a fair bit. I'm not sure it's a good thing. And I tend to distribute things that are alarming, let's say, in some sense. Maybe they're alarming ideologically, they're disturbing. And I was thinking about that today in preparation for this talk, and I wasn't really sure that was necessarily a good idea, because there are a lot of alarming things happening all the time, everywhere, obviously. And now we can share all of them, always, all the time. And so that means that instead of hearing about one alarming thing a day, you're hearing about like 500 alarming things a day. And so then, you know, what are you supposed to do about that? Does that indicate that there's a state of emergency? Well, you don't know, because you don't know how to calibrate the information. So I was thinking, well, maybe the right way to behave on Twitter is only to forward good things that are happening, you know, because there's lots of good things that are happening. But I actually don't know the answer to that. I have no idea, and I don't think anybody else does either. I do know that there are studies with regards to Facebook that show that the more time that you spend on Facebook, the more depressed you are. And that it looks like it's a causal relationship rather than just a correlational relationship. And it seems to have something to do with the fact that Facebook is one of those platforms where everybody puts up an advertisement for their life, right? It's like, here I am with my new girlfriend in the Bahamas being happy, and here I am on a mountain being happy. And it's like, it's not you like miserable with the cover over your head, unable to get out of bed. You don't broadcast that. You can think, well, that means you're presenting people with a falsely positive view of your life, and then they compare their lives to it, and they come up short. And you think, well, that's a kind of deception. But by the same token, you don't stop random strangers on the street and tell them how miserable your life is, right? They don't want to hear about that. They want to see a facade of normality in you know, just casual day-to-day interactions. And so part of pro-social behavior is only to put what's at least, you know, normative and good forward. So it doesn't matter. I mean, so I don't think that's necessarily deception, but the mass consequence of that is something that we don't understand at all. And so, well, so with that sort of introduction, I'm going to kind of walk you through my experience with social media and, let's say, the old media, for lack of a better word. And I'll try to give you a balanced account and to tell you, well, and to see if I can draw some conclusions about what's happened. I mean, my life for the last year has been so busy that I haven't had proper time to reflect on what's been happening. And even if I did, I'm not exactly sure I would be able to understand it anyways, because it isn't sure, I don't think I have a framework of reference within which to put it. So I started working for this company called Television TV Ontario about 15, 16 years ago. I had talked to a producer, his name was Wojtek Szemberg. He's an emigre Polish Jew and a really smart guy. And he phoned me up at the university, and one of the things that distinguishes me to some degree from my colleagues is that I'll talk to the press and that I'm actually not afraid of them or distrustful of them. Like a lot of my colleagues, not all of them, are like they're critical of the press, partly in an arrogant way and partly in a defensive way. They say, well, they always get it wrong. It's like, well, first of all, there isn't a they, and they don't always get it wrong. And they'll also shy away from the press as if they're being intruded upon, when the truth is, generally speaking, the ideas that they're putting forward aren't of sufficient interest to draw public attention anyways. And so, but I talked to Wojtek for a long time, and he invited me to go on a couple of shows, and then I ended up on TVO's The Agenda, which is a pretty good public affairs show. It's one of the few, I would say, deep news shows left that are on normal broadcast TV. And they go into issues in some depth, although they've fragmented that up a bit in recent years. And I became a fairly common guest on those shows, and people seemed to like what I was saying, which always surprised me. But it was good, because it must be pretty damn horrible to put yourself out in the public eye and face primary criticism for what you're doing. I think that would be unbearable in some sense, unless you were very, very strongly constituted. And then, that went on for a while, and Wojtek was running this series called Big Ideas, which was actually quite prescient. So he had lecturers come to Toronto, and he had pretty much all the major public intellectuals in the world over a period of about 5 years or 6 years or so come and deliver bare bones lectures of this sort, fundamentally, and he taped them and put them on TV, and that was sort of unheard of. The production quality was, high, but not overproduced. There weren't multiple cameras and edits and intelligent commentary from people in the background. It was purely content driven, and it actually got pretty popular on iTunes, and you can still find the lectures there. But TVO couldn't, they pulled the show, even though their primary mandate from the government was to educate the public. And this was a very low budget show with very high quality minds that people were actually watching and downloading a lot on iTunes, but they didn't seem to take the non-standard media with any degree of seriousness. And that's kind of a common human attribute, which is that if you don't know about something, you don't take it seriously, right? And it's because if you don't know about it, it's just gray and fuzzy, right? You have no differentiated knowledge, so it's easy to oversimplify it. And I think part of the problem with the classical media, let's say, trying to make a transition to the digital age, is that they have no idea what the digital media is. Like, I was watching an MSNBC clip the other day about this robot. I think her name is Sophia, who has a fairly advanced degree of artificial intelligence and who can manifest pretty realistic human facial emotions. And it was a 4-minute clip and had a 30-second ad at the beginning of it, and you couldn't skip the ad. And I thought, there's a real arrogance on the part of the MSNBC people to put that on YouTube, because anybody who's familiar with the YouTube, let's say, culture knows that, you get to put a 10-second ad on, and then you get to skip it after 5 seconds if you want. Like, you can't ask people to pay 30 seconds of attention for 4 minutes of content. It violates the norms. And so it had only had about 12,000 views. And that's a really interesting example of Marshall McLuhan's idea that the medium is the message, right? As you build a new technological infrastructure, and it's sort of like the old thing, because YouTube is sort of like a TV network. But it's also not like a TV network at all. Partly, for example, because when you put something on YouTube, it's permanent. And that's way different than broadcast TV. Like, it's seriously, revolutionarily different. And so, and it's also the case too that, and this is a strange thing, and I don't think the classic media understands this either, is that YouTube people don't like high production values. In fact, they're very cynical about them. And I think that's because they've come to identify advanced editing and glitz as markers that the information is actually being manipulated, which of course it is. Now, for better or worse, I mean, editing doesn't have to be manipulating, but it certainly can be. And so, and besides that, a lot of the more tech-savvy people that watch YouTube can duplicate those sort of special effects in their own home in half an hour, so they're no longer markers of the kind of competence and technological prowess that would signal the sort of competence that you could trust. So what YouTube viewers seem to like is basically ordinary people, more or less, trying to have an intelligent conversation about something confusing and important. And the attention span that people are willing to devote to that is actually quite remarkable for a medium that was nothing but cute cat videos, say 5 years ago. The fact that, like, a lot of my lectures, like Joe Rogan's podcast, like 3 hours long. It's like, what the hell? People weren't supposed to have that capacity to pay attention in this era of fragmented attention. You know, in Rogan, I don't know if you know this or not, he has 120 million downloads a month now. So that's 1.5 billion downloads a year. And so the last time I saw him, and that was with Brett, who just spoke, I asked him what it was like to be the most powerful interviewer the world has ever seen. Because I think he probably is, if you think about it in sheer numbers. I mean, maybe Walter Cronkite back in the 60s had some comparable influence, but he said, I just don't think about it. And like, what the hell is he supposed to think about it? Because no one knows what to think about that. And so he just has the conversations and posts them, and away he goes. But he has no idea what role he's currently playing in society, and we don't have proper metrics for measuring it, and we don't understand it at all. So anyways, I did these big idea lectures with Wodek, and they were ranked on the TVO channel, and the 5 lectures or 6 lectures I did all ended up in the top 20, which really surprised me, but it was an indication that there was something about what I was talking about that for which there was a market. And now there's some reasons for that, I think. You know, when I wrote a book from 1984 to 1999 called Maps of Meaning, and a lot of the things I talk about come out of all the reading I did during that period, because I was reading an insane amount and thinking really non-stop 16 hours a day. Like, the only way I could stop myself from thinking was to go work out with weights. I couldn't shut off my concern with the issues that I was dealing with, and I was spending about 3 hours a day writing, and I did that every day for 15 years, and that was the consequence. That was the book. And the writing also helped a tremendous amount, because it helps clarify your thinking, writing, you know, because actually you're smarter when you write, because you can externalize your thoughts, and then you can use your working memory to analyze what you've written instead of remembering the thought. And so you're externalizing your memory. You can analyze what you've thought. You can refine it. You can reorder it. You can edit like mad with a word processor, which is also a very new thing. Editing is very difficult if you have to do that with pen and paper or with a typewriter. It's like, forget it. You get your first draft and that's it. And so, but what I was doing with Maps of Meaning was I was trying to solve a problem, and the problem was the problem, as far as I was concerned, that underlie the conflict between the Western world and the communist world, essentially. And that problem was, well, the reason it was a problem was because we were so highly armed, even as we are now, and of course that problem's manifesting itself once again with North Korea. That might render everything we're talking about completely irrelevant, right? Because we don't know which catastrophe is the one most worth worrying about. But I was interested in the conflict between the communist way of looking at the world and the Western way of looking at the world, and I think I actually had a postmodern concern with that, because one of the things I was curious about was, well, the world is susceptible to a multitude of interpretations and opinions, and the communist interpretation is one form of interpretation, and the Western capitalist democratic form of interpretation is another form of interpretation. And is there any grounds on which you can determine that one of those is superior to the other, or more correct than the other? Or is it a matter purely of opinion and social organization, or maybe even warfare, to determine who's going to be the victor? Maybe there's no other way of determining who's going to be the victor than actual conflict. It's certainly possible. And so I started to look underneath belief structures, and I didn't know you could do that really to begin with. You know, my first degree was in political science, and I kind of wandered out of that when the professors kept insisting to me in the upper years of my studies that all the conflict between human beings was driven by economic disparity. And I just never bought that, because that's like saying that people fight about what they value. And for me, that just begged the question of, well, yeah, fair enough, obviously, it's almost self-evident. But the real question is, why do they value what they value? Because human beings are quite a diverse lot, and it's not self-evident why we value some things rather than other things. Like if you're starving to death, it's obvious that you're going to value food, but that's a limit case, you know, it's not that interesting. So it's too simplified. So I didn't find that a compelling explanation, and I still don't. I think the economic explanation for human conflict is shallow and tautological even. And then I started to read some people whose writings really gripped me. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon, you know. And I was studying psychology by this point. I switched into psychology, and I was starting to read the psychoanalysts, and I really got interested in what they had to say, partly from reading Freud, because I was really interested in his analysis of family dynamics and of dreams, but more particularly from reading Jung. And one of the things I learned from Jung, which really has never ceased to shock me, was he basically made a point, and the point was that you're not master in your own house, that there are forces that are operating on you at an unconscious level that determine, for example, the direction of your attention. So, for example, you know how sometimes you'll read something and it'll really grip you, and then you read something else and you can't even concentrate on it. And you might say, well, I need to concentrate on this boring thing, because an exam depends on it, or a promotion, and there's just no damn way. You're reading it and your attention flits all over the place, and you're undisciplined and all that. But then you have this other thing and it just grips you like this, and you think, okay, well, what's doing that? It's not your will, because your will would be the thing that would allow you to concentrate on whatever you chose to concentrate on. It's something underneath your will that's actually directing your attention. And you could say, well, it's random, but of course it's not. It's maybe random if you have a serious case of schizophrenia, and I think in some sense that's actually the definition of schizophrenia, but it's not random if you're a functioning human being. The thing that grips your attention and directs it to one place or another is something it's a deep instinct. It's a manifestation of what Jung called the self, which is a very interesting idea. So Jung thought, it's such a cool idea, he thought that the mechanism that directed your attention in the present was your future self attempting to manifest itself in the present world. So you might say, well, you have a potential, and that potential is what you could be in time. And in order for that potential to manifest itself, it has to be palpable in the present. And the way that instinct for further development manifests itself in the present is by directing your attention towards things that are likely to increase your competence and further your growth right now. And that's just an unbelievable idea. It's like your potential better self beckoning to you in the present. Amazing. And I really can't think of a better explanation for it than that. That's a really good explanation, but a very frightening one, because it means in some sense that something as fundamental as your attention is more or less controlled by processes that are so deep that you don't have a tremendous amount of voluntary control over them. Like, you can interact with the forces to some degree, but you're not one of those creatures that can just tell yourself what to do. Life would be really easy if that's what it was like, right? It's time to go to the gym 3 days a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, you're Superman in 2 years. And you're going to eat properly, and you're not going to drink too much, and you're not going to take cocaine, and all of these things. You just tell yourself that, and bang, you quit. And it's kind of weird that it isn't that way, but it's really seriously not that way. Anyways, when I was looking at the difference between the communist system and the Western capitalist system, I started to get underneath the belief systems to find out what was there. Jung was extremely helpful, and other thinkers that I'm sure you've heard me mention if you've listened to my lectures, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn, seem to be the people who had dug deepest down into those subterranean levels. And what I found, I think, was that the communist system was very shallow. It was predicated on a set of rational assumptions that were generated by a handful of people with no real biological or historical rooting. And I think that the fact that that was the case was part of the reason why, when those ideas unfolded in real time, they were so murderous. They just weren't. Imagine that, Karl Marx was thinking, well, here's the game that we're playing and here are the rules. And so that he laid out the rules explicitly. And then people made societies that followed those rules, and it turned out that that game didn't work at all. He just got it wrong, and seriously wrong. Whereas in the West, the ideas emerged from an unbroken historical process that stretches back probably to the beginning of civilization, say, maybe all the way back to Africa. Who knows how ancient these ideas are. And there's an unbroken continuity of ideas that emerged up, and they're expressed in symbolic form, and it's on that symbolic platform, which actually matches our biology and our behavior, that our more articulated ideas rest upon. And so I found that extremely useful and surprising. I mean, it wasn't what I expected. And at the same time, I had another problem that emerged while I was dealing with this, and one was that I come to understand what group identity meant to people. Like, you have to have a group identity because you live with other people, and unless you have a shared identity. Jonathan talked about this a bit. Unless you have a central pole around which you're all oriented, it's all chaotic and confused, and you're in constant conflict and warfare. It's like, that's a bad thing. You do not want that. And you're all confused individually and all of that. That's a state of chaos. It's unbearable. But if you tighten up the group identity to too great a degree, say like the Nazis tried to do, then the probability that you'll come to blows with other groups reaches almost a point of certainty, right? And so it seemed to me that human beings were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. On the one hand, if you dropped your group identity, then you fragmented and degenerated into chaos. And if you gripped hard to your group identity, then you tilted towards totalitarianism and group conflict. And then I thought, well, that was okay in the past to tilt towards group conflict because, when we had sticks and swords, we'd have a war and lots of people would get killed and lots of people would get hurt, but the entire planet wouldn't burst into flames, right? So, this inborn dichotomy of catastrophe that characterized human existence wasn't something that could spiral into complete destruction, and so we could get away with it. But now, in a thermonuclear age, it's like we can't get away with it. But that's still what we're like. We're still like that. And so for months I thought, oh my God, I always believed that if you could get to the bottom of a problem, you could solve it. Because that was sort of the definition of getting to the bottom of it. A solution would emerge. And when I got to the bottom of it, as far as I could go, I thought, oh, it's group identity and like group fostered warfare and catastrophe on the one hand, and degenerate nihilism on the other. It's like, well, jig's up, there's no way out of that. And I had a prophetic dream at that point, and I won't tell you the details of that, but it outlined a third path to me that I had already picked up to some degree from reading Jung and also Erich Neumann, who is one of Jung's great students. And that had to do with the embodiment of the idea of the hero and the individual as the pathway of the courageous individual, as the mediating force between the chaos of nihilism and the totalitarianism of authoritarian certainty, that there was a third path. And then I started to understand its relationship to religious thinking, mostly to Christianity, partly because that's my tradition, insofar as I'm a Western person, say. And I understood as well that it had something to do, and that this was what was dramatized in the Passion story in the New Testament, was that it had something to do with taking responsibility for malevolence, because Christ is archetypally the person who takes the world's sins upon himself. And what that means in some sense is that if you read about history, you read about Nazi Germany, you read about the Soviet gulags, you don't read as an observer looking at what other people have done. You read as the subject and the object of the history. You're both the person who was persecuted and the victimizer at the same time. And you have to see both of those inside you as actual forces in order to understand history properly. And of course, that's a very, very terrifying thing to do. It's easier to take the part of victim in some sense, even though that's terrible, right? Because who wants to be the victim of a concentration camp? Obviously, but maybe that's preferable ethically to being the perpetrator. But when you're reading about Auschwitz, you're not reading about past history, you're reading about exactly what people are like. And that's a very terrifying thing. And so one of the things you have to do if you're going to take responsibility for the nature of your being is to take responsibility for the malevolence that's truly part of human nature. And that's part of the encounter with the shadow from the Jungian perspective. And one of Jung's proposition was that the human shadow reaches all the way down to hell. And we're used to thinking of religious language maybe even as outdated superstition, but if you take that sort of statement seriously from a psychological perspective, what it means in some sense is that the malevolence that resides inside you, at least in potential, is of the same sort as the malevolence that produces the worst things that human beings have ever done. And I couldn't see any way out of that argument. I mean, the more I read about the Gulag system in the USSR and what happened in China, and what happened in Nazi Germany, the more it became evident to me that these weren't top-down systems imposed by tyrants on an unwilling, innocent population, but decisions on the part of entire cultures to go down a certain road. Often the leaders were following, which I would say was particularly the case with Hitler, which isn't to deny him his criminal culpability, but Hitler was unbelievably good at letting the crowd tell him what to say. You know, he was a mirror for the crowd, and he was a good orator, but he paid attention to the crowd. And so when he said something that made everyone cheer, you know, their dark hearts would come out in the mob and cheer about something he said that was, say, dramatic or vengeful. Well, then he'd say more of that, and the things that he said that were peaceful, that produced no emotional reaction from the crowd, he just said less of. And so the crowd taught him over time exactly what to sell them. And that can be good in some sense. If a leader does that carefully, that means he's integrating what the crowd wants with his style of leadership. But it can be terrible if the mob is the crowd and the mob is outraged and out for blood. And that's what happened in Nazi Germany. And so you can't blame it on Hitler. That's just not reasonable. It's distributed through the entire population, and it's at the individual level of analysis that's most significant.